As ever, big talking about those big bad builders. Here we are on Cladding Matters, as joined by the faithful few. Of course, we have Hamish McLay, our head honcho, Steve Day of the Building Safety Scheme.org, Wendy Gibson of the First Time Buyers Club, and Silas J. Lees of Wiggy Wham. What Hamish always says is the best way to get the right information is to surround yourself with experts that know more than you do. And I suspect we are under no exceptions today. Today's topic is an interesting one. Obviously, it follows the same theme. It's the flames and finances, the impact of PAS9980 on insurance and safety. And as ever, I'm going to throw Hamish straight under the bus.
Well, direct impact on both flames and finances. So we actually sort of find some kind of standard put together at a time when somebody just wanted to put a standard together and didn't realize the full implications of what they were doing. They were actually trying to rig the finances, I think. And like a lot of other things in life, they tried to, if you like, cloud exactly what's going on by what they've come out with, which is, I guess, is nothing unusual, to be honest. It was the previous government. We can't blame this current government for it. But this particular standard was actually sort of brought out to work alongside the Building Safety Act, which we know itself was actually put together very poorly. So when you're actually going to put something up which has got conflicting data contained within it, putting something like this together to suggest this was a good way of resolving things, it was trying to work figures out which they didn't understand and they didn't know at the time. They still don't know how many proppers have cladding issues. So they haven't got a clue about it. But they're maintaining that this standard is perfectly adequate. However, the regulatory people, the fire people, the insurance companies are all turning around saying, hang on, this isn't safe. So the poor old souls are actually caught there, like Steve. He's actually in a situation where basically he's living under conditions of a fire risk and also financial situation, and he hasn't got a clue where it's going to go because the implications of this particular PAS9980, as they call it, really isn't going to resolve the issue. It has to be done properly. And that's what we're speaking about today, because it really is a quandary and nobody's giving a hint as to how it's going to be resolved. Well, other than the Earl of Lytton, of course, has got a major way of actually going about it. But we have some experts here who are actually dealing more directly with the scenario.
Regard to that. So let me first of all throw next under the bus Silas. Now look here, sir. I know that you are intimately involved in trying to help people stuck in this situation move forward. I know that Wendy is constantly pulling at her hair because many of the people that come to her find it into impossible, intolerable situation. What say you about PAS9980, another form of swear word?
Well, this is an interesting scenario, and one which we seem to be seeing more and more of, where there is proposals put forward which don't actually seem to solve the problem. And I think the challenge that we have here at the moment is, just to piggyback on what Hamish has said, there are many buildings out there at the moment that are not exactly fire safe, aren't able to get proper insurance, and this causes a major problem for the buyer or the homeowner who actually owns the property and is seeing the value of their investment diminish over time. So this is a huge problem that needs to be addressed in a more effective manner than I think is currently being proposed.
Well, look, Steve, I'm going to come straight over to you. You know, Michelle, who's often here, who is a QS, and will often say that all buildings have a potential to be fire unsafe, but it's the way in which they are put together, that with fire breaks and so on and so forth, that makes all the difference. This PAS9980, is this a watered down, ineffectual effort at trying to provide some sort of fire safety?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. So firstly, PAS allows material that is banned on new buildings to be allowed on existing, right? So the question I would say to anyone that says, oh yeah, you can leave combustible material on buildings, everything's combustible on building, why is it banned on new buildings? So someone took a view that that wasn't the case. But anyway, let's have a look at the standard, because this standard is used for all the post-Grenfell remediations going around the country using public funding, the taxpayer money, your money, and of course the developers who sign the contracts. So this is what the standard says about its use. Key dramatic voice, I apologize, but I don't get a chance to act too much.
Go on then.
For some stakeholders, there is no appetite to consider a risk-based approach. And for these stakeholders, the only satisfactory outcome is certainty in the performance of external walls and a spread of fire. So they're basically saying, if you're a good builder and you want to use a standard that eliminates the risk in the event of a fire, then don't use this standard. And what they say is this standard cannot be used where the principal objective is to eliminate risk to life due to fire risk.
Oh, sorry.
Okay?
How many human lives is okay to risk?
Well, how many deaths are acceptable? Because the standard itself says don't use this standard if you're a good builder, but if you're a bad builder and you want to have a certain number of deaths, then it's a great standard to use for that. And the great thing is you don't have to keep to either regulations previously at the time of construction or existing regulations. This sits in between both of those, doesn't look at the state of the building as is, and doesn't need to look at the current regulations. To give you an update from Royal Artillery Quays, because this is related to PAS. So we've said that the building, the fire shafts are really dangerous, right? They're not compartmentalized, which means fire can come in from outside and go up the stairs.
But hang on a moment, didn't you get the fire people themselves to agree with you that in fact it's unsafe?
Well, they did a bit more than agree with me. Firstly, they told me to go and do one after an initial inspection. So then I escalated to the assistant commissioner, who then did another investigation after showing that I proved that the fire stairs were not wide enough by 30 centimeters. I proved that the stairs weren't compartmentalized. I proved that the fire lift and the fire stairs are not in the same compartment, and many other breaches. Anyway, I worried them enough to reconsider their opinion and to come over and have another look. And they've now written to me this week, issuing a notice of deficiency to the landlords. And it's very, very serious. And I'm going to go into the detail of that because I think they'll do another watered down approach. But it really should all come off. Now, this is where we come to the PAS standard. So we've got an unlawful construction building. Then the PAS comes in and they do a risk assessment and they ignore the state initially of the building. They say, oh, it doesn't matter. As long as we're putting something that's right on the building, let's ignore the history of the building. You know, it could be falling down tomorrow. Who cares? As long as what we're adding is, acceptable. And then the third point is, it doesn't have to be acceptable in terms of the current regulations, because they're allowing material that is banned on new buildings to stay on our existing buildings, all these combustible XPS panels going up the fire shaft. So I agree with the standard. You shouldn't use it if you're a good, conscientious builder and want to eliminate risk to life. You need to use it if you're a rubbish builder. And I think that's why we're seeing a high take-up rate in the UK's major builders.
Wendy, it seems that it's acceptable to put people in buildings where there's a risk to life, or at least a solid risk to life. It seems that there is some unknown number which is quite acceptable.
Which is a really shocking perceptive to have, but actually it seems as that might be the case. What's really alarming is that it seems to be such a blatant disregard for human life. You know, our health and safety executive initiative is supposed to be there to minimize the risk to life. And it feels as though the regulation within the building industry is doing the complete opposite. I really fear for people who live in these properties and are also being duped into buying such properties because they don't know any better. So it really is important for us to get an awareness out there to make sure that people know exactly what they are getting involved with. The cheap flats which are being sold are cheap for a reason, because they come with a sting in the tail of either stupendously high insurance premiums, or they are unmortgageable and uninsurable to begin with. So there's no such thing as a bargain to be had. We need to really make sure and be careful.
Silas, is it buyer beware, or is it there are definitive basics that we should expect to be in place so we don't have to beware?
That's a great question, Gareth. I think speaking to a couple of solicitors this week when they were suggesting that the liability of a solicitor is now creeping because of how do you foretell what dangers could be within a building that they're not surveying experts in. In fact, it appears that some of these buildings would fool surveyors going to look at them, and the problems only come to light 5 or 10 years later. I would imagine at Royal Artillery Quays there was several surveyors that must have walked through the building in order to value properties on behalf of the lender, and of course they've had the wool pulled over their eyes. So it shouldn't be that much of a case of buyer beware that you need to check the structural integrity and fire protection of a building that is practically brand new. I mean, that's the crazy part about this, is that those buildings are not very old at all, and so I think it's tragic that this is going on. But what I think we do need, and I'm going to be a little bit outspoken on this point, but what I think we do need is a good public prosecution of a board, perhaps an entire board of a national house builder, or somebody of that caliber, and that will drive the change that's needed in the industry. I think, we can all want massive change across the entire industry, but I think one good public execution, for want of a better phrase, would be what's needed to get everybody on board with, actually, let's do this right, because I don't see any difference to what is a corporate manslaughter issue here, where if people are dying in a building that has been built deficiently, where do we draw the line between a murder and a corporate murder or manslaughter? To me, it seems a perfect parallel.
It just worries me that having the Grenfell inquiry looming large as it is, very much in the public minds, that and there are builders, Barrett's to name but one, who have obviously fallen foul of not taking much notice of these recommendations, in fact trying to avoid removing XPS panels, etc., etc. And yet they've now been awarded master builder status. What is that about?
It's absolutely crazy. I was in a mortgage market briefing last week in London, and I can't say too much about the context of that, but the Lloyds Banking Group were openly boasting about their relationship with Barrett, and I just thought, well, are you really sure that you know who you're getting into bed with here? Because
yes, exactly.
If Royal Artillery Quays was a one-off, if it was just that one building that we were having a problem with, you could argue that it's a one-off, and you'd like to think they'd step in and remediate. But the reason they're not doing it is because it doesn't just apply to one building.
Yes, because it's the golden rule in building, isn't it? If it's happened once, it'll have happened 1,000 times.
100%, and so you've got huge costs of remediation, which could be enough to put them out of business.
Steve, I have first of all have to quickly draw attention to the fact that you have been fighting a fight to become a councillor, and the reason why you've started that fight has been because of getting involved in this effectively as a social issue, not just where you are, but because there are so many other thousands of locations that will be suffering the same plight.
Yeah, it's interesting what Silas was saying about Lloyd's boasting about their relationship about, well, maybe they should have a look at the government remediation developer stats and see the 1 in 3 life endangering defect rate.
It's very sobering, isn't it? Very sobering.
Where's their due diligence? If you had another company, maybe Boeing suddenly announced that they now have a 1 in 3 defect rate on planes, that put your life at risk, would you really want to be bragging at a conference about that amazing aircraft company? And would you even go on one of those aircraft? You wouldn't. So they need to do a little bit more research on the government website. It's available to everybody, may I say.
I remember in the 80s, a very
you know.
famous airline was who had previously had an untouched safety record. Suddenly their stats started slipping and planes falling out the sky. And very soon that company went bankrupt. Now it just belies logic that somebody that is providing products that are obviously flawed could possibly achieve such a status.
Well, this goes back to the PAS, as we're talking about the PAS today. So post Grenfell, this came in, right? This is something as a response to dangerous material. So they banned material that was combustible on buildings above 18 meters. However, this PAS allows it to stay on. And the PAS says this: although the methodology in PAS seeks to apply a degree of quantitative and as well as qualitative judgment, given the state of readily available knowledge and performance data, i.e. there isn't much, it follows that the FRA, which is the fire risk assessment, will inevitably, to a large degree, subjective. People are going to work it out based on their experience, you know. And they say it's going to require professional judgment from competent persons. Well, there's no fire performance evidence for any of the material on that fire shaft they want to leave on. He doesn't know what the risk is, so let's hope his subjectivity is excellent and his professional judgment is competent as per the SPAS, because if it isn't, and it's a lot of faith we're placing in one man, the fire engineer, I would take that stuff off because it's banned on new buildings. So the PAS is a very, very sketchy standard. And
it also occurs to me the amount of money, effort, and time and energy they put into not taking it off. They could have saved all that just by bloody taking it off in the first place.
And also, just on affordability, so we looked at the affordability of the builders for our building safety scheme, and you know, they made £31 billion in the last top 10 builders in the last 10 years. They have a debt load capacity because of that, and they also have a huge amount of land banks. We did a few scenarios where we were looking at affordability, and we have a mechanism to push onto the levy to avoid any insolvency risk of a builder. That would also go onto the construction industry, which can be levied at a higher rate than the builders because they've already paid through the developer contract. So we've got a whole load of mechanisms to ensure that all of that is possible. But the problem is the government, and this is where it comes to conflict of interest, and this is the root cause of the PAS. Initially, they had something called the consolidated advice note, which basically said, take all the combustible material off, Grenfell's terrible. Then all the builders signed the developer pledge at gunpoint from Michael Gove, threatening to put them out of business if they didn't sign the responsible actors scheme. Well, they didn't want to be responsible, but they had to be to stay in business. So they joined up. So, oh dear, they now have to do everything. Then the standard of remediation then becomes PAS, the not consolidated advice note, where you can be subjective and decide what you want to leave on, because the builder has got an independent fire engineer, and we found out our fire engineer in writing got a little bit confused and thought he was working for Barratt when he was working for the two freeholders. I was like, who have you been talking to, Mr. Independent Fire Engineer? So yeah, so this conflict of interest to keep the builders without spending much money on the remediations, and to put the problem back in the box will only work if the insurers and the lenders buy that, and they don't. And that's where the big problem is happening.
So what's effectively happened is they've been told they've done something wrong, and then it's become a bit of a Monty Python. So you've done something wrong. Crucifixion or freedom? Which one do you want? Oh, freedom. Okay, off you go. Yeah, it's pathetic, really.
No, you've got to put it back in the box. You put it back in the box. You have to say the remediation can be sort of halved. What you need to do to fix it isn't actually what you needed to do. You can get away with it, and they get someone that's so-called independent that they lean on, and you create a standard where it's really hard to hold that person to account because it's all subjective, as the standard clearly says. And the standard also says don't use it if you want to eliminate zero risk to life, because you can't really use the standard for that. It's not really designed for that. So you've got this really dodgy standard. You've got one person that's so-called independent. The builder can lean on. They get confused whether they're working for the builder or the person that's hired them. And then you get all this stuff left on. And then the insurers and the lenders make loads of money out of you. And that's where we're at. That needs to change. That's what our work is in the House of Lords. And follow us for the Building Safety Scheme Mark II. We have a new amendment coming with some easier ways of getting the same redress scheme than we originally had. So watch this space.
Marvellous. Hamish, you've heard this miasma of nonsense. Well, can you give us some last thoughts, please?
Well, there's very few last thoughts to give. We until we have people who themselves have ethics sufficient to be concerned about the residents and the properties which they themselves have built. It's just something I find hard to get my brain around. They've actually made profit out of this whole thing, and they know what happened at Grenfell, and it hasn't just happened at Grenfell. We're so fortunate in so many of the fires that have broken out, we haven't lost too many lives. But I mean, isn't that a sad thing? We haven't lost too many lives. We have lost lives. We have people in dire situations because they've been forced out of property. We could go on for ages to say the situation people have found themselves in. Yet somehow these builders are fussing around, and because, as we said, it's a subjective thing, and they can make their own minds up as to whether it's going to be safe, whether those residents can actually live safely and feel safe in the properties they're in, and not have any financial difficulties imposed upon them because of what they have chosen to mess up in the first place. It's a bit like, if we can put it this way, there's a load of dog poop around, and somehow or other, the dog's owners are not responsible for actually picking it up for some reason or other.
Well, to extend that analogy, it's like at the moment that the poop has left the dog, it ceases to be the dog owner's responsibility altogether.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Rubbish. All right, well, look, it only remains for me to thank our esteemed cast of players here today. Of course, Hamish McLay, who stands over the lot, trying to bring some sanity to proceedings. Steve Day, who's living the dream, or is it the nightmare, in buildingsafetyscheme.org, and his continuous fight with the Earl of Lytton to try and get some sort of sensible justice, so that not just him, but everybody else who's stuck up in those horrendous blocks of flats, etc., can get some support. Silas J. Lees, who's there trying to find a way through this nonsense, and Wendy Gibson, who's wringing her hands and trying to help that first-time buyer actually get on the ladder in the first place. Guys, I thank you all for sticking with us. I believe there is light at the end of the tunnel. I'll try not to think of the oncoming train it might be, but I think Steve and the team with the Earl of Lytton are beginning to win through. Goodness gracious, it should happen sooner rather than later. But to all of you, I promise you, good things are ahead. New Year's are coming. Look forward to that Christmas. Keep your feet on the ground. Keep reaching for the stars. And for goodness sake, look after that mental health. Bye-bye now.
There's a tale about some folks with hammers and some nails. They'll polish through the moon, but their word always fails.